The Latin Stones have been around for quite some time, at least since the 1980s. They are heavily allied with the Black P Stones and are in the same family with Black P Stones and Familia Stones under the People Nation Alliance. The Latin Stones started in the year 1980 when the Spanish Vice Lord started in South Deering and the Spanish Gangster Disciples formed in South Chicago nearby. The SVLs and SGDs were started by the Black Gangster Disciples and conservative Vice Lords in order to break their racial boundaries and start a Latino faction of each of their gangs. They did not do this in collaboration with each other. In theory, the Black P Stones got in on the action and started their Latino offshoot gang called the Latin Stones that were placed in the South Chicago neighborhood to combat the SGDs. The Latin Stones have a very interesting history that ties in heavily to major events going on in the South Chicago community. In the year 1988, a major war began between a South Chicago gang called the Young Bloods and the Latin Kings that were trying to grow large in South Chicago. The war raged on for 2 years until the Latin Kings defeated the Young Bloods, causing the Young Bloods to join multiple South Chicago gangs, like Latin Counts, Latin Dragons, Very Mellow People, and Spanish Vice Lords. Some of these old Young Bloods didn't want to join any other gangs, so they started their own gang instead. These Mexican youths knew some big-time Black P Stones from the Northern Englewood Motown branch and became sponsored by the Black P Stones of Motown. They became a Hispanic gang of Stones known as the Latin Stones in the year 1990. The organization was put together by Husky and guys like PR. Husky and PR were not leaders, instead it was a guy with the last name De La Paz. Back at home in South Chicago, the Latin Stones were not recognized as legitimate by the various branches of Black P Stones in South Chicago except for the Maniac P Stones. The Maniac P Stones were a very significant branch of the Black P Stones and were always a top-tier branch close to both Black P Stones and the El Rookins. The Maniacs were mediators with conflicts between Black P Stones and El Rookins, and were the only branch of the Stones that was officially allowed to use the name Stone during the El Rookin sanction days of the 1980s when Jeff Fort declared all Stones to be not legit. The Maniacs were the only exception. Because the Latin Stones got the blessing from the Maniacs, this was a big deal, especially since the Maniacs were also posted by 83rd Street. The Latin Stones were now declared legit by 2 major BPS factions, but it wasn't enough in the eyes of the Latin Stones, so they connected with the north side of Chicago and got further sponsorship from the Puerto Rican Stones and Puerto Rican Future Stones. Now that the Latin Stones were satisfied with 4 major Stone sponsors, they opened their first turf at the intersection of 82nd and Commercial in the South Chicago neighborhood and were of course fully taken into the People Alliance. The Latin Stones became slightly allied with Latin Counts in the area, but mostly allied with Black P Stones. The Latin Stones mainly engaged in wars with Gangster Disciples, Ambrose, and especially Spanish Gangster Disciples. The Latin Stones worked with PR Stones and Future Stones from the north side as they moved drugs, weapons, and reinforcements up and down Lake Shore Drive, bringing in significant revenue and keeping each of their gangs well armed and paid. Since the Latin Stones were so heavily allied with Black P Stones, they worked with the Black P Stones with this Lake Shore Drive trade too. This was serious business and really helped bloom the Latin Stones in their early years, and by the mid-1990s the Latin Stones were growing in popularity in South Chicago. By 1993 or 1994 the Latin Stones opened at 90th and Exchange. The Stones also opened up in the suburbs of Waukegan and in Kenosha, Wisconsin after Snaggs moved to Waukegan and founded both chapters and became the leader of those suburban chapters. I'm not sure exactly when it happened, but the Stones opened up at 82nd and Coles, which would later become a significant section. The Latin Stones remained significant in the rest of the 1990s and into the early 2000s and had not only a strong South Chicago chapter but also strong chapters in Kenosha and Waukegan. The downfall began in the mid-2000s when the founder and overall leader seemed to disappear and the South Chicago General Husky retired from the gang life alongside PR the chief enforcer. This depleted the leadership of the Latin Stones, forcing Snaggs to pack up and move back down to the South Chicago community after he left Kenosha and Waukegan closed. When Snaggs arrived, he closed down 90th and Exchange and moved all operations to 82nd and Coles. A war erupted in the mid-2000s with the Latin Counts, which was costly, and at this time the Latin Stones began to shrink but have remained active as a low-key group.